An Undeceptions podcast.
Well, there it is. It's official. Puerto Rico's finest, Bad Bunny, will be the Apple Music Super Bowl 60 halftime show in February on NBC and Peacock. Bad Bunny, he's a three-time...
That's a clip from September 2025 when the NFL officially announced that Puerto Rican rapper Bad Bunny would headline the 2026 Super Bowl halftime show. The halftime show is a big deal. Past headliners include Justin Timberlake, Beyonce, and my beloved U2. There's usually upwards of 100 million people tuning in to watch. Bad Bunny, whose real name is Benito Antonio Martinez Ocasio, is one of the most successful artists of the 21st century. With 6 Grammy Awards now to his name, millions of streams and sold-out stadium concerts under his belt. He's definitely Super Bowl worthy. But not everyone was happy with the choice. As with many of his pop contemporaries, a lot of his lyrics are pretty sexually explicit, and people complained. This, combined with his outspoken political views and the announcement that the performance would be entirely in Spanish, left many calling for an alternative. Turning Point USA, the organisation founded by the late Charlie Kirk, soon had an alternative to offer. A fortnight after the Bad Bunny announcement, TPUSA launched its own all-American halftime show, which would stream at the same time as the Super Bowl concert. The alternative would showcase American culture, freedom, and faith, they said. Here are the words of Erica Kirk, the CEO of TPUSA and widow of the founder, Charlie Kirk.
In all of our programs, it's holistic. It's for the entire home. It's for every age. And so for us to be able to provide an alternative that's pro-America, that's just pro everything, that's not the opposite of what they're putting out there. I don't want to go into details and bash that because there's apparently an audience that wants that, but there's a larger audience that wants ours. And so we are going to make it.
So both performances went ahead. Bad Bunny's was a pop extravaganza with guest appearances by Lady Gaga, Ricky Martin, and Puerto Rican ensemble Los Pleneros de la Cresta. The all-American halftime alternative was more rock and roll, as you'd expect, pre-recorded in a warehouse in Atlanta, and featuring the likes of Kid Rock, Brantley Gilbert, and Lee Brice, among others. Now, I don't really have an opinion on which was better. I didn't watch the TPUSA one. I watched the official Super Bowl show with Bad Bunny, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't like it. Naturally, I hated the sexualization. It demeans human beings, in my view. But it was also far more spectacle than musical. I texted my daughter Josie during it. She was in a pub in Sydney watching it with friends. Quote, "I don't understand why people like this bunny dude." She wrote back, "Haha, he's cool. And it's important for Latinas because there's been a lot of racism about him performing today." "Oh," I replied. "Well, I wish his singing was good." Now, I hope I haven't made any enemies with that. Feel free just to laugh at me like Josie did. But I did heap praise on the guy who sang the national anthem. Charlie Puth, I'd never heard of him. He was fantastic, I texted Josie. Now that is a musician. We'll link to his performance in the show notes. My point, in case you were wondering why we were going with this, the call for a family-friendly alternative to Bad Bunny raised many an eyebrow. Was this just another example of fuddy-duddy conservatives complaining from the sidelines? Or is there really a line that those with classical convictions shouldn't cross when it comes to consuming art? That's just one of the questions I'll be tackling in this episode, our 16th Q&A. I'm John Dickson, and this is Undeceptions. This season of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic. You can get discounts on their special Master Lectures video courses and free chapters of many of the books that we talk about here on the pod by going to zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. Every episode of Undeceptions, we explore some aspect of life, faith, history, science, culture, or ethics that's either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. With the help of people who know what they're talking about, we're trying to undeceive ourselves and let the truth out.
Hey, producer Kaley here. As usual, director Mark and I will be taking you through this episode so John can focus on answering the questions. Our first question, as John has already alluded to, is from Arabella.
Hi, Undeceptions. I've been seeing a lot of stuff online about what Christians can and can't consume. For example, that we shouldn't listen to any music except worship because it's ungodly. This is quite hard to follow as a teenager in 2025 with social media, and I would love to know what you guys think about it. I know in Philippians there's a passage about focusing your thoughts on things that are lovely, true, and pure, but what extent should we take that in everyday life? Thank you.
The first thing to say, I suppose, is that we should be able to recognise skill and artistry when we see it. The opening chapter of the Bible declares God's own masterpiece, the creation, tov, good. This Hebrew word captures both aesthetic beauty and moral worth. What's more, there are some cool passages around the building of the Old Testament tabernacle, the huge mobile tent where the Israelites worshipped. Various kinds of artists and craftsmen, yes, they were all men, are praised for their artistic skill.
Then Moses said to the Israelites, "See, the Lord has chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and he has filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of artistic crafts. And he has given both him and Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, the ability to teach others. He has filled them with skill to do all kinds of work as engravers, designers, embroiders in blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen, and weavers, all of them, skilled workers and designers." Exodus, chapter 35.
In the early days of Christianity, of course, there was little opportunity to reflect on these things. Christians were a tiny minority, typically from the lower classes. Survival, more than art, was at the front of mind. But as Christianity became more settled by the end of the 4th century, people did start to reflect on art and music. The view of Augustine of Hippo around the year 400 is laid out in a volume titled On Christian Teaching. It's really important. It's one I set for my students here at Wheaton. He lays down a basic principle that while some pagan science, philosophy, and art is frivolous and even demonic in his view, much of it is also good. The simple discovery of true and beautiful things in God's world. And he makes the point that just as the Israelites plundered the Egyptians when they escaped slavery in Egypt, so Christians can take the treasures of pagan learning and put them to good use. And once the great Augustine had laid down that principle, others ran with it. I think in a really positive way. One of my favourite examples is Cassiodorus, a century after Augustine. We absolutely have to do an episode on him one day. He was amazing. He was an Italian statesman who turned to being a monk, and he lived until he was 95. His life's work was establishing what you might call a great books program for his fellow monks. His magnum opus was called The Institutions of Divine and Secular Learning. Volume 1 deals with all the important theology and Christian-related books people were meant to read. Volume 2, though, comments on all of the pagan works people should enjoy and learn from, according to Cassiodorus. There's a beautiful section on music where he praises loads of pagan writers on the topic. He describes these artists and thinkers as offering, quote, laudable instruction on this subject and pleasing and useful knowledge which both raises our understanding to the heights and pleases our ear. It's because of the theoretical groundwork of people like Augustine and Cassiodorus that the Church of the Middle Ages was so thoroughly committed to art and music. It wasn't secular rulers who produced and preserved art and music. It was Christians who were always looking for the genius of God built into beautiful things and residing in certain men and women in whom God had given all kinds of skills to make artistic designs, as the book of Exodus, chapter 35, had put it. And happily, this did include some remarkable women. We're planning an episode on Hildegard of Bingen, who produced some beautiful music in Germany in the 1100s. Any chance, Kaley, we can have a little example in this episode? I'm suggesting her song O tu suavissima verga, which still, nearly 1,000 years later, makes it onto collections of all-time classic soaring musical works. What do you reckon? Any chance we can get that little number?
Maybe. We'll see.
When she was a toddler, my daughter Harriet used to sneak out of her new big girl bed when she was supposed to be going to sleep. You could hear her padding down the hallway, and one time I got up to put her back to bed and found her sitting on the staircase with her hands over her eyes. "Let's go back to bed, little one," I said. And her face turned towards me, still with her hands over her eyes, and she said, "But Mum, how can you see me?" She thought that because she couldn't see me, I couldn't see her. Our next question reminded me of that. It comes from Abigail, who's wondering why God seems to be hiding. If he really wants us to come to him, why doesn't he just sit out in the open?
Hey, Mr. John and the whole Undeceptions team. This is Abigail from North Carolina. I've been wrestling through the idea of God's hiddenness recently and would just love for y'all to do an episode on it at some point. It's been on my mind a lot over the last few years. Why is the existence of God something that can be questioned? I understand someone not being a Christian because they are rebelling against God in some way, but why is there doubt surrounding his very existence? Thank you so much for everything y'all do. Undeceptions has been a huge blessing to my life. Keep it up, y'all.
It's a great question, Abigail, and I was about to give you my best effort. Then I remembered that my friend, Dr. Max Baker-Heitch in the philosophy department at the University of Oxford, has done loads of thinking and writing on this theme. So I phoned a friend.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Abigail, for a great question. Yeah, so this question of why God isn't more obvious, why there would be room for doubt, is a significant question in philosophy of religion, which is the branch of philosophy that I work in. And there's a philosopher called J.L. Schellenberg who in the last 30 years has essentially turned this question into quite a formidable argument against God's existence called the argument from divine hiddenness. In a nutshell, Schellenberg's argument says that we would expect a loving God to make his existence perfectly clear, so we wouldn't expect there to be any ambiguity. But the fact that there seemingly is ambiguity is a sort of decisive reason to think there isn't a loving God. Now, there's been lots written on this, and there's been lots of responses to Schellenberg, and I think there's three things I'd want to say. So firstly, can we think of any reasons God might have for not being as obvious as we might like? And I think these just have to be sort of possible reasons. We don't have to claim to know that these are God's actual reasons. So let me give you one example of a reason that's been suggested for why God might not be as obvious as we might like. And this comes from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard basically gives this parable, if you like. He asks us to imagine that there's this extremely powerful king, think of a sort of medieval monarch, has absolute power, and he's fallen in love with one of his subjects, a humble maiden. But he's smart, so he realizes that if he goes to the maiden in all of his royal splendor, he's going to completely overwhelm her. The power imbalance is such that her response won't be a free response of love. It will be a coerced response. And so his solution is to adopt the guise of a peasant and go to her in a humble way and win her heart that way. So then her response is a genuinely free one. And so, Kierkegaard's thought is that there's an enormous power imbalance between us and God. In fact, much greater than that between a medieval monarch and one of their subjects. And so if God comes to us in a way that such that his power is completely obvious to us, then we would be overwhelmed. Our response would be coerced. Now, God obviously isn't going to disguise himself as someone else, but what he can do is dial down the obviousness of his existence, and in that way go some way towards mitigating the power imbalance between us. And Kierkegaard suggests that God's solution, according to the Christian faith, is that God has come to us in an extremely humble way by becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So coming to us in person, but in a way that doesn't overwhelm us, because his divine power, his omnipotence and so on isn't completely manifest in that way of coming to us. Okay, the second thing I want to say is that I think we need to reflect on the question of what God might be aiming at. So is it just that God wants everyone to have intellectual certainty that he exists? In which case then probably the best approach would be to be as obvious as possible, perhaps, make the stars spell out writing in the sky and so on. But if it's something else, then that might not be the best approach. So if it's that God wants us to respond out of a certain heart attitude, out of a certain kind of desire for relationship with God, then it might be that being as obvious as possible isn't the best approach. And the French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal gives voice to this thought in his work, Pensée. And he suggests that God has set things up in a way that there's enough light for those who want to believe and enough shadows for those who don't. And this brings me to the third thing. So you might say, oh, well, that's all very well, enough light for those who want to believe, enough darkness for those who don't. But I do want to believe, or I've got a close friend who really seems to want to believe, and yet the light doesn't seem to be there. And I want to say that I take this really seriously, not least because Jesus says, according to Matthew 7, verse 7, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. And there are two things I think I would want to say about that kind of heartfelt doubt. The first is that, and I really don't mean to say that no one is sincerely seeking, but I do think we need to be constantly aware of how difficult it is to truly know our own heart motivations, let alone those of other people. But the second thing is that Jesus' promise about asking, seeking, knocking doesn't say anything about the time frame in which the answer will come. So the fact that someone has been sincerely seeking and seemingly not receiving an answer doesn't imply that there won't be an answer in the fullness of time. So thanks again for that question, Abigail, and I hope that that's somewhat helpful.
Hey, it's Director Mark. Our next question is from Troy. Hello, John and team. You recently mentioned one of your university professors having a recommended list of books that he considered must-reads. It would be great to have a similar list on the Undeceptions website. As a historian and theologian outside the Bible, what would be your top 10 or 20 books that you consider a must-read for listeners to Undeceptions?
First, there are those novels recommended by my good friend Simon Smart, the head of the Centre for Public Christianity in Australia. He challenged me years ago that I, as a strictly non-fiction reader, really should read some novels. And so he laid down the law. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, On Beauty by Zadie Smith, Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, East of Eden by John Steinbeck, I'm still in the middle of that one, Crime and Punishment, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Cloud Street by Tim Winton. Americans, go out and get that one. I reckon it's maybe the best Australian novel ever. And just for fun, let me add a first century Greek novel that Buff and I read to each other years ago over our morning cup of tea. It's called Kaliro by Carrington. It offers amazing insight into ancient Greco-Roman romance, adventure, religion, ethics, and much more. Then there are some biblical and theological works that I've found super influential. Confessions and The City of God by Augustine, Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, Reformed Dogmatics in 4 volumes by Herman Bavinck, woohoo! Systematic Theology in 3 volumes by Wolfhart Pannenberg. And then there are a couple of hidden gems that might not be in the same league of influence as those other ones, but I have found personally very influential. There's Gospel and Kingdom by Graham Goldsworthy. And then there's what's called Introduction to the Bible. It's the first section of a unit that's offered everywhere by Moore Theological College in Sydney. And on Jesus specifically, you can't go past Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Borkham, Jesus Remembered by James Dunn, The Gospels and Jesus by Graham Stanton, and then there are some non-theological works that might include The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, Testimony by Tony Cody, Holocaust Testimonies by Lawrence Langer, Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry, After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre, On Rhetoric by Aristotle. And then just about every second volume of the excellent Oxford Very Short Introduction series, which covers just about anything you could imagine. Happy reading.
Phew, John got a bit carried away there. You can check out the full list and links in the show notes at undeceptions.com. We'll be right back.
This episode of Undeceptions is brought to you by Christopher Palmer's new book, A World Without God, out via our season sponsor, Zondervan Academic. What does meaning in a world without God look like? That's the big question at the heart of the book. And honestly, I love this one. Christopher explores in a narrative-like way, like a beautiful story, some of the moral challenges our world faces when it doesn't have a belief in the divine. And to do so, he draws upon the wisdom of some pretty big names, including Camus, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and even the Book of Judges from the Old Testament. A world without God follows the implications of not just a secular society, which is a good thing, but a secularizing society that seeks to rid the culture of any signs of religion. But this book also offers hope to readers who are wondering how they can find stability in an ever-changing world, spirituality in a material world, and even truth. Yes, truth in our post-truth atmosphere. To find out more, head to zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions.
The largest single genetic study of Neanderthals has been released in the Nature journal today. It focuses on a close-knit community of cave dwellers in Siberia who lived 54,000 years ago. They all died in the cave, and fragments of their DNA is helping researchers understand a bit about how they lived. Joining me now from Wollongong is one of the study co-authors, Professor Bert Roberts from the University of Wollongong. Bert Roberts, welcome. So just to put this into some broader context first, when did Neanderthals emerge as a species? When did they disappear, and where did they primarily live?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. We know a lot about Neanderthals. The first traces we have them might be 430,000 years ago in Western Europe, and the last traces seem to be about 40,000 years ago, also in Western Europe, but we know they extended as far as Siberia.
That's a news clip from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation back in 2022, looking at new research on Neanderthals, or Neanderthals if you want to be closer to the German. Neanderthals are named after the Neander Valley in Germany, where the species was first discovered in the 1850s. We loved this next question because it relates to two of our episodes in this season, our episodes on evolution and also on God's image. Thanks, Mark.
This question comes from Hannah. I agree that evolution and an old Earth view can align with a Christian perspective in the world, but I was wondering how our human ancestors fit into God's plan for humanity. Specifically, would other types of now extinct humans, for example Neanderthals, have been made in the image of God? Would they have had souls and needed God's salvation? I'd appreciate any thoughts on the matter. Thanks.
Hannah, what a great question. Let me begin with, I don't know the answer. I'm open to whatever the creator decides on things like these. But since you asked me directly, here's my hunch. If you listened to our episode on the image of God recently, you'll know that this expression, image of God, has nothing to do with capacities. It's not about our moral sense or our rationality or whatever. And this is why a baby is in the image of God, or a severely mentally disabled adult is in the image of God. The expression refers to God's own decision to regard human beings as his offspring, his children. What that means is that the higher or lower intelligence of other creatures in the animal kingdom has no bearing on whether they're made in the image of God. The higher apes and the dolphins apparently have more intellectual capacity than a 1 or 2 year old human being, but I don't think they're made in the image of God. That said, if you go back and listen to our episode on animals, that's where you'll hear why I think the Creator has a special relationship with the animal kingdom, without any of those animals serving as God's image in the world. And that's a long-winded way of saying that I doubt extinct species like the Neanderthals were created as the image of God. That only belongs to Homo sapiens. But I don't doubt that the Neanderthals had some kind of relationship with the Creator. In fact, I bet as higher beings in the Homo genus, they consciously revered the Creator in a way that was even more explicit than dolphins. As for the future kingdom, I don't know, but as I say in the animals episode, I don't think the question, will my dog be in heaven, is a dumb one at all, given that the kingdom come is the renewal of all creation. I should probably stop there before I get into trouble.
Here's another question from our recent episode on evolution, this time from Jen. Hi, John. I really enjoyed your recent episode on evolution. I take a similar view to you on the topic, but many believers I know and respect, including my own husband, disagree. I don't find it productive to debate the ins and outs of textual genre and the reliability of carbon dating when the central truths of the gospel remain the same. But one thing I've always struggled to answer is the question of why the good God we know, who has revealed himself in the Bible, would choose to use death through many evolutionary cycles in order to create. Death is pretty clearly revealed as an aspect of the brokenness of this world. And yet we know God's work of creation is deeply good. So having it inextricably entwined with brokenness is hard to reconcile.
This is a big one. To maintain that there was no death before the first human beings is really to deny the entire fossil record. And in my tradition of Christianity, that's the tradition encouraged by Augustine of Hippo, when an irrefutable fact of our world or of logic clashes with our interpretation of Scripture, we are spiritually obliged to question our interpretation. Not scripture, but our interpretation. Fortunately, in this case, some details in the Genesis text itself, I think, open up real possibilities for us to think through this question. Let me give you a little bit of Bible and then some philosophy and a reasonably undogmatic conclusion. God told Adam that shunning the good, sinning, would result in death. That's right there in the middle of Genesis chapter 2. He says, "In the day you eat of that tree, you shall surely die." Of course, they eat from the tree in chapter 3, and they don't die. At least not in the obvious, straightforward biological sense. What happens instead in chapter 3 is that the three spheres of their existence begin to unravel: the social sphere, the physical sphere, and the spiritual. Socially, human relationships with one another become strained, so we're told that they feel ashamed in each other's presence. When God confronts them, Adam blames Eve, and then we're told Adam and Eve are going to really struggle against each other. Physically, secondly, the very environment is frustrated. We're told that women will have pain in childbirth. We're told that the ground will produce thorns and thistles. And spiritually, they become alienated from God. We're told in the middle of chapter 3 that they hide from God. The one made in God's image is now hiding, ashamed, estranged. These are what true death is about. It's the unraveling of our social, physical, and spiritual life. And the final scene of Genesis 3 puts a seal on this death in the most powerful image of all, because humanity is expelled from the garden and barred from the tree of life, it says. There's a flaming sword put there to guard the way back to the tree of life. So, with all of that in mind, here's the scientific question. Does Genesis teach that there was no death or discord or any kind of imperfection in the natural world before Homo sapiens? As I say, that would clash with the fossil record, which is replete with dead things and decay prior to humanoids. Obviously, Genesis doesn't address itself directly to this modern question, but there are some philosophical and textual things we can say. Philosophically, it was Gottfried Leibniz in the late 17th and early 18th century who famously pointed out that there must be creaturely imperfection in everything that isn't God himself. No matter how hard you try to picture a perfect tree, you can always add one more piece of fruit, make it perfecter. No matter how strong or knowledgeable we think God should have made us, we can always ask, why not a bit stronger? Why not a bit more knowledgeable? The only way out of the dilemma is to imagine God making us all-powerful and all knowledgeable. But that would make us God, which would involve a logical contradiction since there can't be more than one infinitely powerful and knowledgeable entity. In other words, philosophically, limitation and imperfection are intrinsic to being created things. But what does the text say about all of this? Obviously, Genesis isn't engaging in this kind of philosophical speculation, but it's interesting that the narrative itself doesn't imply that there was no death or discord prior to the fall. First, you've got to remember that the word used to describe creation isn't perfect, but good, tov. Imperfect things can be good. Then notice, within the narrative world of Genesis 2 and 3, fruit, which is a living thing, had to be destroyed, had to die every time Adam and Eve ate a piece of fruit from the trees in the garden. And then there's the serpent. This is a creature already in discord with the Creator and in discord with human beings. And it's clear that humans themselves were not inherently immortal. They weren't perfect in that sense of enjoying endless life by their very nature. Not only did they had to eat fruit to survive, they had to depend on the tree of life in the middle of the garden to enjoy unending full life. In other words, the natural state of human beings prior to sin is entropy or decline. which was only halted in the imagery of Genesis 2 and 3 by being nourished by the tree of life. They were preserved from decay in the garden. That's what the text seems to be saying. Inside the garden, humans were safe from the corruption of creation. When they were ejected from the garden, they fell subject to that decay. I hope that helps. You cope with that, Director Mark?
No, that's fine, mate. That's a great representation of one particular approach.
After the break, we talk wealth and Christianity.
In beautiful Lebanon, over 1 million people have been displaced by regional conflict. People living in southern Lebanon and around the capital Beirut have been particularly affected. I got to visit that amazing region a few years ago, and boy, I love what aid agencies are doing, like Anglican Aid. They've launched an emergency fund in response to the recent crisis. Donations will help on-the-ground partners provide basics like clothing, mattresses, and food for people living in makeshift camps. One of these partners said, "This war, as ugly as it is, gives us an opportunity to reach out to these people with the love of Christ." Please head to anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions. That's anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions. Please support this urgent work. Thanks. In the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, there's a little Hebrew word, Selah. Most people take it as a cue to pause and take it all in. That's the idea behind Selah tours. They're for people who want to slow down and explore the extraordinary history of Christianity, not just in books, but on the ground. These trips are more than a holiday, and they're much more than a pilgrimage. They are thoughtful, guided journeys through some of the most significant places in Christian history. Experiences that engage the body, the mind, and for many, the soul. And the memories really do last a lifetime. You can walk in the footsteps of remarkable figures like the Venerable Bede across Scotland and northern England. You can trace the route of the Apostle Paul through Turkey, Greece, Malta, and Rome. You can book your trip now at selah.au. That's SELAH.au.
Now, don't tell them senators this. The last time we totaled it up, which has been some time ago, this ministry, since it's been in operation 41 years this month, the last accounting of it, this has been 2-3 years ago, so there would probably be at least 150 million more added to this. Well, our income last year was over $100 million. So there has been over $1.3 billion come into this ministry since it's went into operation. So
that's American televangelist and pastor Kenneth Copeland speaking at a conference in 2008. Copeland's one of the richest pastors in America. His current net worth is an estimated $300 million US. And as you just heard, he's not exactly shy about his financial position. Copeland is well known for preaching a prosperity theology. Essentially, the idea is that the more money you give, the more you receive back. Or as Copeland would say, money! Yikes. Copeland is an extreme example of, at times, preaching a money-focused gospel. And that runs against what Jesus taught. But what is a biblical approach to money, and how might things like modern economics affect how we understand what the Bible has to say on it? That's the crux of this next question, which comes from one of John's students.
Hey, Dr. Dickson. This is one of your students from Wheaton, James. In many episodes and in class too, you'll mention how we judge the Christians in the past, but if they got the chance, they would totally judge us for our love for comfort and wealth. My question to you is, how would you teach on wealth in our contemporary society? I mean, it seems that Jesus and the church fathers had a lot to say on the matter, but it seems like a topic that quite literally nobody is talking about, at least in the West. And the only ones who are talking about it seem to be people from the Mennonite tradition, people I respect, but I'm not quite convinced by all their arguments. What are your thoughts on this, or would you even do an episode on this in the future?
Well, my very first experience of Christianity in America, 25, 30 years ago, was arriving in Nashville as a musician, turning on my TV and being greeted by the classic TV evangelist. He had a Pierre Cardin suit, slick back hair, and a beautiful Southern accent. And his message that day was that God was a God of prosperity, and God wanted to prosper our lives. I'd never heard anything like it. He had a special prayer cloth that he was promising to send us free of charge with every $1,000 donation that would actually make you rich. Apparently, if you put it somewhere in your house, you'd be able to buy the house of your dreams, in your garage, and you'd have the car of your dreams, in the pantry, and you'd always have enough food, and on he went. And then he showed us footage of his own home and car collection to prove that it worked. I honestly thought I was looking at a joke. So I got out my little dictaphone, which I carried everywhere in those days for song ideas, and recorded what I was hearing. And I still have the recording somewhere. I'm going to try and dig it out. That'd be awesome. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that that message is a blasphemy. Or to put it more mildly, a departure from what Jesus taught. But let me put all this in historical context. I want to read a Twitter thread I composed a year or so ago. It's actually the most interacted with tweet I've ever offered, positively and negatively. It doesn't provide a complete answer to your question, James, but it does express the fear that you and I both have for the modern church. Here's the thread. I teach a class here at Wheaton College on the history of Christianity, focused on the first 1,000 years. One thought haunts me. We are right to look with shock and disappointment at the way medieval Christians accepted violence as a norm. It seems clear that in seeking to convert European warrior societies, Christians themselves were converted to a martial ideology, in contradiction to the teaching of Jesus. We see this with clarity today. We even question whether they could have been real Christians. I am equally struck by how medieval Christians wholeheartedly obeyed Jesus' call to shun wealth and pursue charity. They said the one who doesn't show material mercy has not known divine mercy toward their sins. For me, this is the most striking part of medieval church history. So here's what haunts me. Without denying we are right to condemn medieval Christians for their violence, I wonder if they would have every right to rise up and condemn modern Western Christians for the way we accept the pursuit of wealth and pleasure and comfort as norms. They might say that in seeking to convert modern materialistic societies, we ourselves have been converted to a materialistic ideology. They might even wonder if we are real Christians after all. I hope not. I like to think not. But when I teach the history of Christianity and find myself and my students condemning medieval Christians for violence, I have this nagging anxiety about my wealth, pleasure, and comfort. I am not claiming to be a modern-day prophet, only confessing that I am an anxious historian. Does that answer your question, James? No, I don't really have an answer. All I know is that you're asking the right question.
We've come to the final question for our regular listeners. Plus subscribers will get to hear John answer a few extra questions, so stay tuned. If you want to become a Plus subscriber, follow the link in the show notes, undeceptions.com/plus. This last question comes from Kimberly.
Hey John, I only just today really thought about how Jesus himself got baptized. I thought it was a little odd. Jesus doesn't need to be made clean. Moreover, other people were also getting baptized, even though Jesus hadn't even died and been resurrected at that point. Their baptisms were representing something that hadn't even happened yet. Do you have any thoughts about why these baptisms happened and what they could mean?
Thanks, Kimberly. Of course, Jesus himself gave the answer to this when John the Baptist asked him. You know, John the Baptist was really hesitant when Jesus came to him for baptism, and Jesus is recorded as saying, "This is to fulfill all righteousness." Okay, so there's something good, right, proper about Jesus being baptized. And there is a sense in which that's pretty clear. The first thing to note is that originally the baptism of John the Baptist was a picture of the rebirth of Israel. That's why it had to be at the Jordan River. That's where centuries earlier Israel had begun its national existence, crossing through the Jordan into the Promised Land. John's baptism seems to have been a piece of prophetic theatre, as scholars call it, calling Israel to begin again or be doomed. In this sense, it makes sense that Jesus, whose ministry was all about the renewal of the people of God, would lead the way in being baptized in the Jordan. Incidentally, most scholars think that his selection of the 12 apostles was also a deliberate sign of the same idea. The 12 apostles symbolize the 12 patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel, who are now being renewed. It's true that baptism also symbolizes washing, the forgiveness of sins, and I think that's what makes us wobble here. But that theology is embedded in the larger meaning of God's people beginning again through the waters of the Jordan. Then there's the simple fact that Jesus attended all of the major festivals at the Jerusalem temple. The Day of Atonement, Passover, he practiced Hanukkah. Jesus himself didn't need any of those sacrifices and prayers that went on during the festivals, but it was right and proper. It fulfilled righteousness, we might say, that he endorsed them with his presence in order to highlight that the important truths embedded in these rituals were about him. We also know that every worshipper at the temple had to have a little wash before they went up into the temple space. Every one of them. Jesus must have done this too. He didn't need the washing in the spiritual sense, just as he didn't really need the rituals going on up in the temple. But he would have done it so that these actions could serve as pointers ultimately to him. I think something like that explains why he also underwent baptism. Thanks.
That was truly instructive, by the way.
Yeah, that's actually bothered me for a while. So, yeah.
I never thought about that before.
Great to do some undeceiving live with the team. Kaley, of course, knew it backwards. Hey, thanks for putting up with so much of me in this episode. I guess that's the nature of the Q&A beast. If you've got more questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at questions@undeceptions.com or head to undeceptions.com and leave a voice message so we can hear your lovely tones. We'll pile them up to consider for our next Q&A episode later in the year. There's just one episode left for this season, coming to you next week with the podcasting Christian man of the moment, Wes Huff. He's been on Rogan, Diary of a CEO, and now Undeceptions. So stay tuned. See ya. Undeceptions is hosted by me, John Dickson, produced by Kaley Payne and directed by Mark "Bad Bunny" Hadley. Sophie Hawkshaw is on socials and membership. Alasdair Belling is a writer and researcher. Siobhan McGuiness is our online librarian. Lyndie Leviston remains my wonderful assistant. Santino Dimarco is chief finance and operations consultant. Peter Kozushko is our North American representative. Editing by Richard Hamwi. Our voice actors today were Yannick Lawry and Dakota Love. Special thanks to our series sponsor Zondervan for making this Undeception possible. Undeceptions is the flagship podcast of undeceptions.com, letting the truth out. An Undeceptions podcast.